Please, you have to believe me. I didn't do it.
You have to understand, when 17-year-old Haley Morgan walked into that courtroom, she wasn't walking into a hall of justice. She was walking onto a stage. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her with a sound like a final verdict, sealing her in. The air was cool, smelled of old wood and lemon polish, and was thick with a silence that felt heavy, judgmental. But Haley, she just squared her shoulders and put on her best bored expression. This was all just an inconvenience, a boring intermission in the fabulous movie of her life. She let her eyes drift across the room, making a show of it. She saw her parents sitting ramrod straight in the first row. Her mother's face was pale, her hands clenched tight in her lap. Her father looked tired, old. For a split second, something twisted in Haley's gut, but she shoved it down. Then she saw them, a couple of her friends from school, who'd somehow gotten out of class to watch the show. She gave them a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk. "Watch this," it said. Her lawyer, a young guy named David in a suit that looked a size too big, gestured for her to sit. He was a public defender. The moment she'd found out, she'd almost laughed. She leaned over, her voice a low whisper. "My parents' real lawyer will be here any minute. No offense, but I don't need a handout." Before David could answer, a sharp command echoed through the room. "All rise." Everyone stood. The shuffling of feet, the rustling of clothes. Everyone, that is, except Haley. She took her sweet time, slowly pushing back her chair, making a point of finishing the stretch before she bothered to get to her feet. The bailiff shot her a warning look, but she just met his gaze with a cool, blank stare. The first act of her performance had begun. And then he entered. Judge Harold Jennings. He was an older man, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and hair the color of brushed steel. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that commanded the entire room. He didn't look at the crowd, or the lawyers. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, went directly to her. It was like being pinned by a spotlight. For a single, heart-stopping moment, her confidence wavered. There was something in his gaze, a deep, unshakable calm that felt more powerful than any anger. The charges were read aloud. Vandalism, criminal mischief, failure to appear. And then the prosecutor described the victim, the historic town square fountain she'd plowed her BMW into after a party. When he said the words, "the People's Fountain," Haley couldn't help herself. It was a stupid piece of stone with a cherub on top. Who cared? The whisper slipped out, laced with all the contempt she felt. "It's a piece of stone," she muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Who cares?" A sharp intake of breath came from her mother's direction. Her public defender flinched like he'd been slapped. And Judge Jennings? He didn't react. He didn't yell. He simply picked up his pen, made a small, precise note on the paper in front of him, and then looked back at her. His silence was 1,000 times more terrifying than any shout could ever be. The stage was set. And Haley was about to learn that she wasn't the director of this play. Not even close. The prosecutor, a serious woman with a no-nonsense haircut, stood up. "Your Honor, the state would like to enter Exhibit A into evidence." A screen flickered to life at the side of the courtroom. And suddenly, Haley's own face, blown up and pixel-perfect, was staring back at everyone. It was a video from her own social media, taken just hours after the accident. There she was, leaning against her damaged BMW, a plastic cup in her hand. Her hair was perfectly messy, her makeup flawless. She laughed, a high, tinkling sound that now felt alien and cruel in the quiet courtroom. "So, I guess I'm Daddy's little fountain crusher," she said to the camera, gesturing with her cup. Off-screen, you could hear her friends laughing, egging her on. That ugly thing was begging for a redesign anyway. In that moment, sitting in that cold, hard chair, Haley didn't see a fun, rebellious post. For the first time, she saw what everyone else saw, sheer, unadulterated arrogance. The casual cruelty of it all hit her like a physical slap. Her eyes darted from the screen to her father. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He had bowed his head, his shoulders slumped in a posture of pure shame. The mask of indifference she wore so carefully, It slipped. Just for a second. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes widened, just a fraction, with a dawning, horrible understanding. This wasn't a game. This was real. But fear, for someone like Haley, often translates directly into anger. It's a defense mechanism. So, as the screen went dark and the room settled back into that heavy silence, she doubled down. She hardened her expression, clenching her hands into fists under the table. Judge Jennings looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Miss Morgan," he said, his voice calm but filling every corner of the room. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Haley took a breath, and with a defiance that was now starting to feel brittle, like glass about to crack, she met his eyes and repeated the line that had just damned her. "Yeah," she sneered. "Like I said. It could use an update anyway." The gasp from the gallery was audible this time. It was the sound of a line being crossed. And Judge Jennings, he didn't react with anger. He just made another quiet note on his pad. And in that silence, Haley's bravado suddenly felt very, very small. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, how does a kid get this brazen? This entitled? Well, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens with 1,000 small permissions. 1,000 ignored red flags. And as the prosecutor stood up to outline Haley's history, it was like watching a fuse being lit that led all the way back to her childhood. The prosecutor called it a pattern of escalating, unaddressed behavior. But let me tell you what that pattern really looked like. Flashback, 3 years ago. Haley, 14 years old, standing in the sleek, minimalist office of a high-end boutique manager. She'd been caught slipping a $300 silver necklace into her purse. Not because she needed it, but because she was bored. Her mother, flawless and frantic, had rushed in. She didn't yell at Haley. She turned to the manager, her voice a symphony of polished annoyance. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, handing over her credit card. "My daughter would never need to steal. She probably just forgot it was in her hand." The word need did a lot of work there. The incident was wiped away. To Haley, the lesson was clear. Consequences were for people who couldn't afford to write a check. Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor read the incident report from that day. Haley barely remembered it. She looked at her nails, feigning boredom. But inside, that first flicker of unease was growing. They knew about that. Flashback, last year. Haley, 16, fuming after getting a C on her history paper. Mr. Davison, her teacher, had written unoriginal and poorly sourced in red pen. So, later that evening, she took her keys and, with a satisfying scrape, carved a long, deep line along the side of his decade-old Toyota Corolla. When the school called her father, his lawyer called the school back. They argued it was hearsay, that there were no direct witnesses. A settlement was reached for the damages. No apology was ever made. The lesson deepened. Not even authority figures could touch her. In the present, the prosecutor's voice was steady as she described the vandalism report. Haley's stomach tightened. She glanced at Mr. Davison, who was sitting in the back of the courtroom, his arms crossed. He'd come to watch. The reality of the audience, of all these people from her past seeing her here, began to sink in. The prosecutor laid it all out. The school suspensions for talking back to teachers, brushed off as personality conflicts. The speeding tickets that her parents' lawyer had gotten reduced to non-moving violations. Every single time, the system, or her parents, had bent around her. They'd sanded down the sharp edges of every consequence until she believed, truly believed, that the world was made of soft landings. And now, sitting in this courtroom, she was still operating on that old script. As the prosecutor spoke, Haley picked up a pen from the table. She started doodling on the legal pad in front of her, a little sports car, a fancy high heel. It was a performance for her friends, a way to say, "See? I'm not even listening. This is all a joke." But the joke was starting to feel thin. The evidence of her life was being laid out like a map, and for the first time, she could see the destination it was always leading to. This right here. This courtroom. This judge who wasn't smiling. The mask of boredom was back on her face, but her hand, holding the pen, was trembling just enough to make the lines of her doodle shaky. She was so busy pretending not to care, she didn't even notice that the judge had stopped writing and was watching her, his eyes missing nothing. Not the doodle. And certainly not the tremor in her hand. The prosecutor finished her list of incidents and sat down. The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of waiting. All eyes were on the judge. Judge Jennings didn't speak right away. He slowly laid his pen down on the desk, aligning it perfectly with the edge of a folder. He then brought his hands together, his fingertips touching, almost as if in prayer. But his eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, never left Haley. It felt less like being looked at, and more like being read. Like he was turning the pages of her soul, and he didn't like the story he was seeing. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't the booming thunder she'd expected. It was low, calm, and it carried through the silence with an absolute, terrifying clarity. "Miss Morgan," he began, and the words felt like they were meant for her and her alone. "This court has now heard a detailed account of your actions. But this court is not particularly interested in the cost of the fountain, or the value of a necklace, or the paint job on a car." He paused, letting that sink in. Haley's doodling pen stilled. What was he talking about, if not that? "You see," he continued, "this courtroom is not here to adjudicate property damage. It is here to adjudicate character. And what I see before me is a profound and deeply ingrained sense of entitlement." The word hung in the air. Entitlement. It was a word Haley had heard before, usually from teachers she dismissed as jealous. But coming from him, in this room, it felt different. It felt like a diagnosis. He leaned forward, just slightly. "You have been taught, through a consistent and regrettable lack of consequence, that the world exists for your convenience. That communities and their rules are mere suggestions for other, less important people. That your pleasure outweighs another person's property, a teacher's respect, or the dignity of this proceeding." Each sentence was a precise, surgical cut, slicing through the armor of her arrogance. He wasn't yelling. He was explaining. And that was so much worse. Haley could feel a hot flush creeping up her neck. Her heart was starting to beat a little too fast, a little too loud in her own ears. She felt exposed. Naked. This old man was saying out loud all the unspoken rules she lived by, and he was making them sound cheap and ugly. The anger, her old familiar shield, began to rise again, hot and defensive. He was still talking, his voice still that same, measured tone. "The difference between being privileged and being entitled, young lady, is that privilege is in circumstance of birth. Entitlement is a choice. It is the choice to believe that your circumstance makes you superior to the rules that bind everyone else." That was it. The word superior snapped something inside her. He thought she felt superior? He thought he could just sit up there and psychoanalyze her? The fear was instantly consumed by a wave of white-hot rage. She didn't even let him finish his thought. She shot up from her chair, the legs screeching against the floor. "Are you done with the lecture?" she spat out, her voice trembling not with fear, but with pure, unfiltered contempt. "I have places to be." The gasp from the gallery was sharp, collective. Her public defender, David, physically recoiled, whispering a desperate, "Haley, no." The bailiff took a full step forward, his hand going to his belt. But Judge Jennings? He didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply held up a single hand, a calm, quiet signal to the bailiff to stand down. His eyes remained locked on hers. And in their depths, she didn't see anger. She saw something far more unsettling, a deep, profound disappointment. And in that moment, for the first time, Haley Morgan felt truly, terrifyingly small. The silence after Haley's outburst was the deepest yet. It was a vacuum, sucking all the sound and air out of the room. Judge Jennings lowered his hand. The bailiff took a slow, deliberate step back, but his eyes were locked on Haley, a silent promise of zero tolerance for another move. And in that heavy, suspended moment, Haley's eyes darted from the judge's disappointed face to the gallery. She saw her friends. Two of them, Jessica and Chloe, were staring at her, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror, and a twisted kind of admiration. They were watching her, and in that look, she saw her reflection. The rebel, the girl who wasn't afraid of anyone. The fear and the shame that had been bubbling inside her needed an outlet. And for Haley, the only outlet she knew was performance. If she was the star of this tragedy, she would at least play the part her way. A dangerous, stupid idea sparked in her mind. It was an impulse, a need to reclaim power, to show everyone, especially that old judge, that he couldn't get to her. Slowly, she sank back into her chair, but her posture wasn't defeated. It was theatrical. Judge Jennings had resumed speaking, his voice once again that calm, relentless river of truth, explaining the principles of civic responsibility. As he spoke, Haley chanced a quick glance back at her friends. She gave them a tiny, almost imperceptible wink. Then, she turned back to the judge. And she began to mimic him. It started small. She puffed out her cheeks, imitating his serious expression. She let her jaw go slack, her eyes becoming vacant and dull, a cruel caricature of his thoughtful gaze. Jessica stifled a snort into her hand. The sound, though small, was like a shot of adrenaline to Haley. Emboldened, she escalated. As Judge Jennings steepled his fingers again, Haley mirrored the gesture perfectly, but with a flamboyant, mocking flair. She then pretended to be writing furiously on her notepad, her hand scribbling nonsense in a wild, exaggerated pantomime of his deliberate note-taking. Her public defender, David, saw it happening in his periphery. He slowly, painfully, lowered his face into his hands, his shoulders slumping in utter defeat. He whispered her name, a desperate, hopeless plea. "Haley, stop. For the love of God, stop." But she was too far gone. She was playing to her audience now, feeding off their stifled, nervous laughter. She was winning. She was showing them all that she was above this. The high from the performance was intoxicating, drowning out the last whispers of her common sense. It was the most blatant, disrespectful act the bailiff had likely ever witnessed. The court reporter, whose job was to record every word, actually stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keys as she stared, dumbfounded. Judge Jennings did not stop speaking. He didn't miss a beat. But his eyes, which had been scanning a document, lifted and settled on her once more. He watched her for a full 3 seconds. 3 endless seconds during which Haley, caught in the act, had the audacity to finish her little performance with a slow, sarcastic nod. He finished his sentence. He laid the paper down. And then, he did the one thing that finally, irrevocably, broke the spell. He didn't shout. He didn't cite her for contempt. He didn't even look angry. He looked sad. A deep, weary sorrow filled his eyes, the kind you reserve for something broken beyond repair. He let out a soft, almost inaudible sigh, a sound of profound disappointment that somehow cut deeper than any gavel slam. And he said, in a voice so quiet the entire room leaned forward to hear, just 2 words. "I see." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of shock or anticipation. It was the silence of judgment passed. The finality in those 2 words was absolute. The performance was over. The stage had just been dismantled, plank by plank. And Haley was left standing in the wreckage, the echo of her own foolishness the only sound in her ears. The smirk melted from her face, leaving behind only the cold, pale fear of a child who has just realized, far too late, that she has been playing with fire. And the fire was about to fight back. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the wake of those 2 simple words. "I see." The echo of Haley's mockery didn't just fade away. It curdled in the air, turning from an act of defiance into a permanent stain on the record. The judge's sad, knowing look had stripped away every last layer of her performance, and what was left underneath was raw, exposed, and terrified. Judge Jennings didn't look away from her. He simply picked up a single sheet of paper, the sentencing document, and held it in his hands. He didn't even need to read it. He knew what it said. "The court," he stated, his voice now carrying a formal, chilling finality, "is now ready to pass sentence." The words landed on Haley with the physical force of a blow. Pass sentence. It wasn't a phrase from her world. It was from old movies and law shows. It was real. This was really happening. Her breath hitched in her throat, a small, pathetic sound in the vast quiet of the room. Her eyes, wide and desperate, darted to her parents. This was the moment she had been conditioned to expect, the moment where her father would stand up, his lawyer would swoop in, and the whole messy situation would be neatly folded up and put away. But her father didn't move. He kept his head bowed, a man who had finally run out of solutions, out of checks to write, out of strings to pull. The sight of his defeat was more terrifying to Haley than the judge's anger had ever been. Then she looked at her mother. Their eyes met for a single, searing second. Her mother's face was streaked with silent tears, her usually perfect composure shattered into a million pieces. And in her mother's eyes, Haley didn't see anger, or even disappointment. She saw grief. The kind of raw, bottomless grief you see at a funeral. It was the look of someone mourning the loss of the daughter they thought they had. That look broke her. The last remnants of her arrogance crumbled into dust. The confident, smirking teen was gone, and in her place sat a frightened 17-year-old girl who was finally, truly, understanding the word consequence. Her hands, which had moments ago been mocking the judge, were now clenched together in her lap, her knuckles white. She could feel a cold sweat beating on her forehead. Her heart wasn't just beating fast anymore, it was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of its own making. Her public defender, David, leaned toward her, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Haley," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Whatever it is he says, however long it takes, do not speak, do not react, do not move a muscle. You just listen. You understand me? Listen." She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first compliant thing she had done all day. The urge to cry was a physical pressure behind her eyes, a hot, painful knot in her throat. She swallowed hard, trying to force it down. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She wouldn't cry. Judge Jennings adjusted his glasses. The rustle of the paper in his hands was deafening. Every person in the room was holding their breath, leaning forward, waiting for the axe to fall. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, a boring, everyday sound that somehow made the moment feel even more surreal. This was it. The moment before the rest of her life was defined. The moment between the girl she had been and the person she would be forced to become. She looked at the judge, her eyes pleading now, but it was far too late for that. The time for pleas was over. He cleared his throat. And he began to read. Judge Jennings began to speak, and his words were like stones dropped into the still pond of the courtroom, each one creating ripples of dread. "Miss Morgan," he started, his voice devoid of any emotion now, pure procedure. "For the charge of vandalism of city property, the state guidelines allow for a sentence of up to 1 year in a juvenile detention facility." The words juvenile detention facility hung in the air, ugly and concrete. Haley's mind, already reeling, conjured images from movies, bleak rooms, locked doors, girls who were nothing like her. A cold wave of nausea washed over her. She couldn't breathe. A year. A whole year of her life, gone? But he wasn't done. He moved on, methodically, relentlessly. For the charge of criminal mischief, an additional 6 months can be applied, to be served consecutively. Consecutively. The word was a legal barb. It didn't mean at the same time. It meant one after the other. Adding to the pile. He then picked up a different paper. Furthermore, the court has the authority to impose a significant financial penalty. Given the cost of restoring the historic fountain, a fine of no less than $15,000 is within the statute. $15,000. It wasn't about the money for her family, but the number itself was a monument to what she had done. It made the damage real, quantifiable. She saw workers, materials, time, all because of her one stupid night. He listed off the other consequences, each one stacking onto the last, building a prison around her future. Suspension of her driver's license until she was 21. Mandatory community service. Hundreds of hours. A permanent mark on her record that would follow her to every college application, every job interview. This was the script she had always feared but never truly believed would be used on her. This was the full, crushing weight of the law she had spent a lifetime mockingly sidestepping. and it was every bit as heavy as she'd never allowed herself to imagine. Her vision started to tunnel, the edges going dark. The judge's face was the only clear thing, a grim portrait of justice. And then he paused. He set the papers down and looked at her, not as a judge to a defendant, but almost as a teacher to a failing student. "But," he said, and that single word carried a sliver of something. Not hope. Not yet. It carried a change of direction. "The court is less concerned with these statutory penalties than it is with your conduct here today." He leaned forward, and his voice, while still quiet, took on a cutting edge. "What I have witnessed in this courtroom," he said, his eyes locking with hers, "is one of the most profound displays of contempt and disrespect I have encountered in over 30 years on the bench. You have not simply broken the law, you have mocked the very idea of a society built upon laws. You have treated this proceeding, a proceeding designed to seek fairness and accountability, as your own personal stage for a performance of arrogance." Each word was a hammer blow, shattering what was left of her spirit. "You have shown a complete and utter lack of empathy. A total inability to comprehend that your actions have consequences for anyone other than yourself. You sit there now, fearing a loss of your freedom, but you have shown no understanding of why that freedom must be protected, or what it truly costs." He was right. Every single word was true. And hearing them spoken aloud, in this place of ultimate truth, felt like having her soul x-rayed. The hot, sharp pressure behind her eyes finally broke. A single, traitorous tear escaped, tracing a slow, warm path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She was too paralyzed to move. She was braced for it. She was waiting for him to finally bring down the gavel, to cement her fate with the words, "juvenile detention." She was preparing for the doors to slam shut. But that's not what he said. Instead, Judge Jennings sat back, his expression shifting from condemnation to something more complex, more calculated. "Therefore," he said, his tone now one of deliberate, final judgment, "a standard sentence would be a failure of this court's duty. It would teach you nothing. It would simply warehouse a problem until it becomes someone else's." He took a slow breath. "Your sentence will be different." The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward as one. Different? What did that mean? Different how? Was it worse? A longer sentence? A harsher facility? Haley's mind, already numb with fear, scrambled for purchase, but found none. Her public defender, David, looked as confused as she felt. This was off script. Judge Jennings let the word hang there for a moment, ensuring he had every ounce of the room's attention. "It is the finding of this court," he continued, his voice resonating with formal power, "that a period of incarceration in a juvenile facility would, in this specific case, be a redundant punishment. You are already imprisoned, Miss Morgan. You are imprisoned by your own entitlement, by your profound lack of perspective. And simply locking you away with others who have made similar mistakes will not dismantle those walls." Haley could only stare, her tears still wet on her cheeks. He wasn't sending her to juvie? A fragile, impossible flutter of hope stirred in her chest. "Therefore," the judge declared, his tone leaving no room for debate, "I am sentencing you to 6 months of full-time, supervised labor." A job? They were giving her a job? The flutter grew stronger. Maybe this was her parents' influence after all. Maybe it would be some easy, make-work job in an air-conditioned office. But the judge wasn't done. "You will report to the City Public Works Department. Your foreman will be a Mr. Raymond Miller. You will work a standard 40-hour week, performing whatever duties are assigned to you. You will repair sidewalks, clean graffiti, maintain public parks, and yes, you will work on the crew that is restoring the fountain you so casually damaged." The image flashed in her mind, the orange vest, the heavy gloves, the sun beating down, her hands dirty and raw. She saw her friends driving by in their convertibles, pointing and laughing. The hope curdled into a new kind of horror. It was social suicide. It was humiliating. And then, he delivered the second part of the sentence. "Furthermore," Judge Jennings said, and now his voice took on a deeper, more profound gravity, "for a period of 6 months, each and every Saturday and Sunday, you will perform community service at the Haven, a shelter for women and children escaping domestic violence. A shelter? Haley's brain short-circuited. What was she supposed to do there? Your specific duty, the judge went on, as if reading her mind, will be to work in the children's wing. You will read to them. You will play with them. You will be a calm and steady presence in their lives. He let the silence settle for a beat, letting the sheer, bizarre incongruity of it sink in for everyone. Haley Morgan, the fountain crusher, the girl who mocked a judge, being tasked with comforting traumatized children. Your sentence, Judge Jennings concluded, his gaze piercing right through her, is not to simply do time. It is to understand time. To understand the value of an honest day's labor that builds a community, rather than destroying it. And to understand the resilience of the human spirit in those who have faced real adversity, not the petty inconveniences of a privileged teenager. He looked down at his notes, the formalities returning. You will begin this coming Monday. You are remanded to the custody of your parents until that time. This court is adjourned. He struck the gavel once. Crack. The sound was like a starting pistol for a race Haley never knew she was in. It was over. She wasn't going to jail. But as she sat there, the reality of the sentence washed over her. The grueling physical labor, the terrifying unknown of the shelter, the total annihilation of her social life. It didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a different kind of cage, one she had to build herself, day by painful day. And the tears that fell now weren't from fear of punishment, but from the terrifying, overwhelming prospect of the person she was going to have to become. The gavel had fallen. The sentence was passed. But Judge Jennings wasn't quite done. He hadn't moved from his chair. He watched as the reality of his words settled over Haley, as the tears of self-pity began to shift into tears of genuine, bewildered shock. He saw the question in her eyes, the same question that was on the face of everyone in that courtroom. Why? He leaned forward again, his voice losing its formal edge and becoming almost grandfatherly. But a grandfather who wasn't afraid to tell you a hard truth. You are confused, he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. You expected bars. You expected locks. You thought the only way to pay for a crime was with your time, with your freedom. He shook his head slowly, a sad, knowing look in his eyes. But that is a transaction, Miss Morgan. That is balancing a ledger. What you need is not a transaction. What you need is a transformation. The word transformation hung in the air, strange and heavy. You mocked this court, he continued, because you see nothing beyond yourself. You see a community as a backdrop for your own life. So, you will put on a work vest and you will repair that very backdrop. You will pour the concrete for a new sidewalk that an elderly woman uses to get to the grocery store. You will plant flowers in a park where children play. You will, quite literally, build and maintain the world you have taken for granted. You will learn what community feels like in your aching muscles and your tired hands. Haley was listening now, truly listening, her sobs quieted to shaky breaths. And the shelter, he said, and his voice softened further. You will go to the Haven because you need to look into the eyes of a child who has never known a moment of your security, your safety, or your privilege. You need to see what real fear looks like. And you need to understand that your presence, your calm voice reading a story, can be a sanctuary for that child, even for just a few minutes. He paused, letting the imagery sink in. The contrast was staggering. The selfish destruction of a fountain versus the patient act of reading to a scared child. This sentence is not your punishment, Haley, he said, using her first name for the very first time, and it sounded less like a judge and more like a guide. It is your education. It is a curriculum designed for a soul that has been failing its most important classes. You are not being sent away to be forgotten. You are being sent out into the world to finally, for the first time in your life, learn what it truly means to be a part of it. With that, he truly was done. He gathered his papers and stood. But his final words echoed in the silent room, reframing everything. This wasn't an ending. It was a brutal, terrifying, and utterly unexpected beginning. For a long moment, nothing happened. Haley just stood there, the judge's words, "It is your education," echoing in the hollowed-out space where her arrogance used to live. The performance was over. The audience was already beginning to shuffle, to whisper, to move on with their day. But Haley was trapped in the aftermath. Her lawyer, David, gently touched her elbow. "It's over, Haley. We can go." But she couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the polished floor. She watched as Judge Jennings turned and walked slowly toward the door behind his bench, his black robe flowing behind him. He was leaving. He had dismantled her entire world with a few calm sentences, and now he was just walking away. And that's when it truly hit her. The full, crushing, terrifying weight of it all. It wasn't the fear of hard work or the embarrassment. It was the truth. Every single word he had said was true. She was imprisoned by her own entitlement. She had no idea what community or struggle or real fear felt like. She had been so busy performing the role of a queen that she never realized she was ruling over a kingdom of one, a lonely, empty place. A single, hot tear welled in the corner of her eye, defying her command to stay strong. It traced a slow, clean path through the makeup she had so carefully applied that morning, a stark, wet line on her skin. Then another followed. And another. She didn't sob. There was no sound. It was a silent, total collapse from the inside out. Her shoulders, which had been held back in defiance all morning, slumped forward. Her chin dropped to her chest. The tears fell faster now, spotting the dark wood of the defendant's table in front of her. She saw her reflection in the polished surface, a distorted, broken image, streaked with black mascara. That was her. That was the real Haley Morgan. Not the smirking girl in the social media video. Not the defiant actress mocking the judge. This crying, shattered, ashamed girl was who she had been all along, hiding under all that noise. Her parents approached, their faces a mixture of relief and apprehension. But Haley didn't look at them. Her eyes were fixed on the door the judge had exited through. As he reached it, his hand on the knob, he paused. He glanced back one last time, across the now nearly empty courtroom. His eyes found hers. And in that moment, the words came. They didn't feel chosen. They felt ripped from her. A raw, whispered confession that was meant for him and him alone. "I'm sorry," she breathed out, her voice thick with tears, barely audible. A second later, she found a little more strength, a little more air. "I'm so sorry. It wasn't a tactic. It wasn't a performance for the gallery. It was the first genuine, uncalculated thing she had said in that room. It was the sound of a crack forming in the shell around her soul, letting a little light, and a lot of pain, flood in." Judge Jennings held her gaze for a brief second. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. But something in his expression shifted, ever so slightly. From the weary disappointment, to something else. Something that looked almost like a faint glimmer of hope. Then he was gone. And Haley Morgan, the girl who had cried when her sentence was announced, finally let her public defender lead her away, sobbing quietly into the silence she had finally learned to hear. The following Monday, Haley stood in a dusty city equipment yard at 6:45 in the morning, shivering in the gray light of a dawn she usually only saw from the other side, after a long night out. The air didn't smell like lemon polish or her expensive perfume. It smelled of diesel fumes, wet gravel, and freshly cut grass. A man named Ray, the foreman, walked toward her. He was built like a brick wall, with a face tanned and leathered by decades of sun, and eyes that held no interest in who she was or where she came from. He didn't have a file on her. He had a work order. He looked her up and down, from her clean sneakers to the hesitant fear in her eyes. Without a word, he walked over to a metal storage container, unlocked it, and pulled out a bundle of bright orange fabric. He tossed it to her. It was heavy and stiff with newness. "Vest," he grunted. Then he tossed a pair of thick, leather-palmed gloves at her feet. "Gloves. You tear 'em, you buy 'em." Haley fumbled with the vest. It was abrasive against her skin. She slipped it on, and it hung on her frame, bulky and ridiculous. The fluorescent orange felt like a beacon, a screaming announcement of her shame. She was no longer Haley Morgan, socialite. She was worker, in orange. Ray didn't give a speech. He didn't ask if she was ready. He just pointed a thick finger toward a pickup truck loaded with supplies. "You're with me. First job's the town square." Graffiti on the bandstand. The town square. Where the fountain was. Her stomach twisted into a knot. The ride was silent. Ray didn't turn on the radio. He just drove, his large, calloused hands resting easily on the wheel. Haley stared out the window, watching her familiar world blur past. Kids waiting for the school bus. People in business suits heading to coffee shops. A normal Monday, happening all around her, while she was trapped in this absurd nightmare. When they arrived, he handed her a wire brush, a bucket of soapy water, and a putty knife. "Get to it," he said, before walking off to talk to another crew about the fountain's plumbing. And so, Haley began. She scraped at the spray paint, the metallic screech of the brush against the wood setting her teeth on edge. The soapy water sloshed over the rim of the bucket, soaking her jeans and seeping into her shoes. Within minutes, her arms ached with a dull, fiery pain she'd never felt before. Her lower back protested. A blister was already forming on her thumb. And then, she heard it. A familiar, high-pitched laugh. She turned. There was Jessica's car, idling at the curb. Jessica and Chloe were both hanging out the window, phones raised, recording her. "Look, it's Haley," Jessica called out, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Working hard or hardly working?" The laughter felt like physical blows. The heat of humiliation rushed to her face, so intense she thought she might be sick. This was 1,000 times worse than she had imagined. She wanted to drop the brush, to run, to scream at them. But then she looked over at Ray. He had seen it all. He wasn't scowling at the girls. He was just watching her, his expression unreadable. Waiting. Something inside her hardened. Throwing a fit was what the old Haley would do. It would just be another performance. So, she did the hardest thing she had ever done. She ignored them. She turned her back, her shoulders stiff, and she started scrubbing again. The laughter continued for a minute more, then faded as the car sped away. She scrubbed until the graffiti was gone. She scrubbed until her arms were numb and the blister on her hand had burst. She didn't complain. She didn't cry. At the end of the day, as the sun began to set, Ray walked past the bandstand. He glanced at her work. The wood was clean. He didn't smile. He didn't say, "Good job." He just gave a short, sharp nod. Not bad. Trucks leaving in 5. It was nothing. The smallest gesture. But as Haley pulled off the heavy orange vest and climbed back into the truck, that single nod from a man who respected nothing but hard work felt more valuable than 1,000 likes on a post. Her body was exhausted, her hands were a wreck, and her social life was probably in ruins. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt a strange, quiet flicker of something that felt almost like accomplishment. If the public works yard was a lesson in humility, the Haven was a lesson in a reality Haley didn't know existed. The following Saturday, she stood before a nondescript beige building in a part of town she'd only ever driven through quickly, her heart pounding for an entirely new set of reasons. There were no laughing classmates here. Just the quiet buzz of a fluorescent sign and a heavy, reinforced door. A woman named Maria met her inside. She had kind eyes, but they were also sharp and watchful, missing nothing. She didn't treat Haley like a criminal or a charity case. She treated her like a new tool that needed to be shown how to be useful. "The rules are simple," Maria said, her voice low and calm. "No loud noises. No sudden movements. You are a guest in their home, a temporary safe space. Your job isn't to fix them. It's to be a calm, steady presence. For many of the children here, that is a rare and precious gift." She led Haley to a small, sparsely furnished room that served as a library. The books were worn, the covers softened by countless small hands. "You can start in here. Read to them. Or just sit with them if they prefer. Let them lead." A few minutes later, a staff member gently guided a small boy into the room. He couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, with huge, dark eyes that seemed to take up half his face. He clutched the leg of the staff member, his tiny body tense. "Haley, this is Miguel," the staff member said softly. He loves stories. And then she was gone, leaving Haley alone with the silent, watchful child. Haley's confidence, which had been slowly rebuilding through a week of physical labor, evaporated. What was she supposed to do? She felt clumsy and enormous. She forced a smile, her old, practiced, camera-ready smile. "Hey, Miguel," she said, her voice sounding horribly bright and fake in the quiet room. "You wanna read a book?" She reached for a colorful book on the shelf, her movement a little too quick, a little too eager. Miguel flinched. It was a small, instinctive recoil, a tightening of his shoulders and a duck of his head. It was over in a second, but it sent a shockwave through Haley. She froze, her hands still outstretched. In that tiny, terrified flinch, she saw a lifetime of things she had never had to fear. Her bright, empty smile melted away. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice now soft and genuine. "We don't have to." She slowly, carefully, sat down on the floor, putting herself at his level. She didn't look directly at him, instead focusing on the bookshelf. She just sat, breathing, trying to make herself small and unthreatening. The silence stretched, but it wasn't the heavy, judgmental silence of the courtroom. This was a fragile, listening silence. After what felt like an eternity, she felt a small presence beside her. Miguel had inched closer. He didn't look at her, but he pointed a tiny finger at a book on the lower shelf. "Goodnight, Moon." Haley's heart leapt. She reached for it with the slow, deliberate care of a bomb disposal expert. She opened it and began to read. She didn't use a funny voice. She didn't try to perform. She just read in a soft, steady, monotone murmur, like a lullaby. She was halfway through the book when she felt it. A slight, warm pressure against her arm. Miguel had leaned his head against her. He was listening, his body finally relaxing into hers. He didn't say a word. He didn't smile. But that small, trusting weight against her side was more profound than any standing ovation she'd ever received. When she finished the book, he simply stood up and walked quietly out of the room. Haley sat on the floor for a long time after he left. The blister on her hand from scraping graffiti stung. Her muscles ached from a week of hard labor. But all she could feel was the ghost of that small head resting against her. Judge Jennings had told her she would see real fear. But he hadn't told her that in facing it, in being still for it, she would find a strength she never knew she had. She had come to the shelter to be punished. She left feeling, for the first time, that she might have something to give. Weeks bled into months, and the grueling rhythm of Haley's new life began to reshape her, sanding down her sharp edges day by day. The change wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single moment of revelation. It was a slow, quiet transformation, happening in the background of sore muscles and silent car rides. It showed up in small ways at the public work site. One afternoon, Ray pointed to a patch of graffiti on a retaining wall, a complex, multicolored tag. The old Haley would have groaned. This Haley simply nodded, picked up her scraper and solvent, and got to work. She found a rhythm in the work, a focus that left no room for self-pity. She was on her knees, her brow furrowed in concentration, when Ray walked by hours later. The wall was clean. He stopped. He looked from the spotless wall to her. Her clothes were stained, her hair was a mess, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Quit in time," he said, his voice its usual gravel. But then he added, "You stayed late." It wasn't a question. It was an observation. Haley just shrugged, wiping her forehead with the back of her glove. "Wanted to finish it." Ray held her gaze for a second longer than usual, then gave another one of his rare, sharp nods. This one felt different, though. It held a flicker of respect. "Job's done. Let's go." That nod, that tiny acknowledgement, warmed her more than the California sun ever had. The change was even more profound at the Haven. Her Saturday and Sunday mornings were no longer a sentence to be endured, they were the anchor of her week. She and Miguel had developed a quiet routine. He would slip into the library, find her, and silently hand her his current favorite book. He still rarely spoke, but his trust was now absolute. He'd curl up against her side as she read, his small body relaxed and heavy. One Saturday, She was reading him a story about a lost dog finding its way home. When she turned the page, she did a little, silly voice for the dog. It was an impulse, unplanned. And Miguel laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, but a soft, breathy giggle that was the most beautiful sound Haley had ever heard. She froze, the book still open in her hands, and looked down at him. He was looking up at her, a real, genuine smile on his face. In that moment, something cracked open inside her. A joy so pure and sharp it brought tears to her eyes. This wasn't about earning a nod or completing a task. This was about connection. The joy she felt wasn't for herself, but for him. For his moment of happiness. It was a selfless emotion, and it flooded her with a sense of purpose she'd never known. That evening, she stopped at a bookstore on her way home. She used her own money, not her parents', and carefully picked out 2 new books she thought Miguel would love. She didn't see it as a chore. It was a privilege. The most telling change, however, happened late one night. Out of habit, she opened her old social media apps. The colorful, frantic stream of photos felt alien to her now. Pictures of parties she hadn't been invited to, designer clothes she no longer cared about, captions filled with drama that seemed so ridiculously small. She scrolled through her own old profile, looking at the girl with the perfect smile and the empty eyes, the girl who bragged about destroying a fountain. She felt no connection to that person. It was like looking at a stranger, a shallow, loud, and deeply unhappy stranger. There was no disgust, just a sad, distant pity. Without any ceremony, she selected Delete Account. The app asked her if she was sure. She was. She tapped Yes. She put her phone down and looked at her hands. They were different. The nails were short, unpolished. The skin was tougher, with a few small scars and calluses from her work. They were no longer the hands of a girl who did nothing. They were the hands of someone who built, and cleaned, and comforted. She wasn't Haley Morgan, the Queen of Orange County. She wasn't even sure who she was yet. But for the first time, she was curious to find out. The sentence was no longer a punishment. It had become a path. And she was finally, willingly, walking down it. 6 months to the day after she first stood in his courtroom, Haley Morgan walked back into Judge Jennings' domain. But this time, everything was different. The door didn't click shut with the same finality. The air didn't feel heavy with judgment. She wasn't wearing a designer outfit or a jumpsuit. She wore simple, clean jeans and a plain t-shirt. Her hands, resting at her sides, were no longer perfectly manicured, but they were clean and strong. She held her head up, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a calm stillness. Judge Jennings entered, and the room rose. This time, Haley was the first to her feet, her movement respectful and immediate. She met his gaze and held it, not as a challenge, but as an acknowledgement. He opened a file. "This is a review of the sentence passed on Haley Morgan," he stated for the record. His eyes scanned the pages, and then he began to read aloud. From Mr. Raymond Miller, Foreman, City Public Works Department. He adjusted his glasses. Subject completed her assigned duties without complaint. Work ethic was strong and consistent. Showed initiative in tasks beyond her initial assignments. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Without complaint. Strong work ethic. They were simple phrases, but in that room, they were monumental. He moved to the next page. And from Maria Flores, director of the Haven Shelter. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. Haley became a cherished and reliable volunteer. She formed a meaningful bond with one of our most withdrawn children, demonstrating profound patience and empathy. She has made a positive impact here. Cherished. Profound patience and empathy. Haley listened, her heart swelling with a pride that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with growing. She wasn't the same person who had stood here mocking him. The evidence was right there, in black and white. Judge Jennings closed the file and looked at her, his stern features relaxed. "The court is satisfied," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "The sentence is complete. Your record will be sealed." It was over. Truly over. The weight she had carried for half a year was finally, officially, lifted. But before he could adjourn, he looked at her one last time, his head tilted slightly. It was the same man, the same bench, the same question in his eyes, but this time it was different. "Miss Morgan," he asked, his tone conversational now, almost gentle. "Do you understand now?" Haley didn't hesitate. She didn't look away. Her voice was clear and steady, filled with a hard-won certainty. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I do. Thank you." It wasn't just a thank you for ending the sentence. It was a thank you for the aching muscles, for the silent car rides with Ray, for Miguel's trusting weight against her side, for the blisters and the quiet mornings. It was a thank you for seeing the person she could be, long before she could see it herself. Judge Jennings gave a single, slow nod. It was the deepest, most respectful nod he had given anyone in his courtroom that day. "This court is adjourned." The formal sentence was over, but the life she had built within it didn't end. The following Saturday, Haley was back at the Haven. There was no court order mandating it. No one was making her. She walked into the small library, and Miguel was already there, waiting. He looked up, a quiet expectation in his eyes, and held out a new book. This was no longer about serving time. It was about honoring a connection. She sat down, and he immediately curled into his familiar spot against her side. As she read, his quiet presence felt like a gift. She was there because she wanted to be. Because it mattered. She also started a club at her school, something she would have mocked 6 months earlier. A community service club. She didn't preach or give speeches about her experience. She simply organized it. She used her once toxic social media influence for good now, posting flyers and asking for volunteers to help at local parks or shelters. A few of her old friends scoffed, but a few others, surprisingly, showed up. They saw a different Haley, a calmer, more grounded version who led not with arrogance, but with quiet action. She was redefining everything. What it meant to be strong. What it meant to be important. It wasn't about dominating a room anymore. It was about the patient act of reading to a child, or the satisfying ache after a day of honest work. The queen of her own world was gone. In her place was just Haley. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. A few weeks after her sentence ended, a plain white envelope arrived in the mail for Haley. No return address. Her name was written on the front in a precise, elegant handwriting she recognized instantly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead. No formalities. Just a few lines, written by hand. Miss Morgan. The true measure of a person is not how they fall, but how they choose to get back up. You have chosen well. I am proud of the woman you are becoming. Harold Jennings. Haley read the words once, then again, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't from a judge to a former defendant. This was from a mentor to a student who had finally learned the lesson. She folded the letter carefully, her fingers tracing the ink of his signature. It wasn't a pardon. It was something far more valuable, an acknowledgement. He had seen her at her worst, and now he was bearing witness to her slow, steady climb. She placed it in the top drawer of her desk, not to be hidden away, but to be kept safe. A reminder that sometimes the most life-changing sentences aren't delivered from a bench. They are delivered with a quiet hand and a belief in redemption. If you were to walk into Judge Jennings' courtroom now, on a quiet afternoon, you'd hear nothing but the hum of the lights and the distant sound of the city. The benches are empty. The witness stand is vacant. It looks the same as it did the day Haley Morgan first walked in. But if you listen closely, not with your ears, but with your heart, you can still hear it. It's not the echo of her mocking laughter. That's long gone, faded away like a bad dream. No, the echo that remains is the sound of a life changing its course. It's in the memory of a sentence that sounded like a death sentence, but was really a life sentence, a chance at a new life. It's the ghost of a quiet thank you that held more meaning than any legal plea. This room, and courtrooms like it all across the country, aren't just places of punishment. They are crossroads. Every day, stories unfold here. Stories of mistakes, of pain, of bad choices. But few stories have the power to truly change a human soul. This one did. Because one old judge looked at a broken, arrogant girl and saw not a criminal to be locked away, but a person to be rebuilt. And he had the courage to use his power not to break her further, but to make her whole. The gavel's sound has faded, but the echo of its judgment, the echo of that second chance, that lasts forever.